to our second discussion of the Federalist Papers. We are back to talk about Federalist Papers 12 through 22. We'll be doing this again in 2 weeks with the next set up to number 33. Just a quick review of what's going on in each one. The number 12 talks about the utility of the union in respect to revenue. That this new union will allow for better tax collection. And then the second one, you'll have less government duplication. I'm sorry, number 13, you'll have less duplication because you'll have a combination, it'll be what they call economy and government. Then going back to the old dispute of can a republic actually work over a large area, in number 14, and answering that. Numbers 15 through 20, all on the subject of the insufficiency, as they call it, of the present confederation to preserve the union. And that was very important, using a lot of historical examples from ancient Greece, the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and saying that all these things were something like the current Articles of Confederation, and that was not working well either in America or these other places. And then number 21 was, and 22 were about the other defects in the present confederation. So again, it's continuing the idea that kind of the big picture of the constitutional government, that this is going to be better than what we have. We haven't yet gotten into a whole lot about the checks and balances. All that's coming, but this is really kind of the big picture of why this new constitutional government is going to be way better, in their opinion, than the Articles of Confederation. So we talked a bit about the Articles of Confederation last time and how there's some strengths and weaknesses, but the Constitution was written to try to correct those. And so what kind of arguments did everybody see kind of coming through in these papers that were big themes?
Commerce, that in number 12, was that Hamilton? I think a lot of these were Hamilton.
Yeah.
That commerce was very important to national wealth as well as individual wealth. And he makes an argument that commerce would be good to keep taxes low on individuals, that duties would be allowed, that duties could be collected on imported goods, which he saw as a fairer way for a government and a better way for a government to raise revenue as opposed to direct taxation. And he points out that duties could ultimately end up too low if we stay with a confederation or regional governments or 13 individual states, because the competition between them would lead to lower duties and could be overall hurtful to revenue.
That was the main way they wanted to fund the federal government, right? They said,
yes,
you can't do property taxes, you can't do all this stuff, but tariffs and duties and everything, incoming commerce was the way they wanted to do it.
Yeah. One of the things that I read when I studied is that the Articles of Confederation gave as much power to the states as it did to the federal government, and the federal government can't function unless it has superiority. Mm-hmm. Secondly, it took a quorum of 9 to pass a resolution, but it took all 13 to defeat a resolution. Therefore, it seems quite feasible that that would not work as well, because in the beginning moments of this great democracy, it took all it could do just to stand on its feet, because England was still acting fool. You know, they were still, is that right? That England was still trying to do what they could do if they could get away with it. So it just, another paper I had, what paper specifically stated that the articles would not work? I think it was 58 or 55. Well, it's one paper, I mean, it's written by Hamilton just for that purpose alone. I don't remember the number of that.
Well, it's kind of a common theme through all of them.
That I know.
That that Confederation government won't work. Now, in number 15, he specifically talks about I think it's 15 where he talks about the British won't leave the forts they had out in the Western Territory, so a strong federal government would be able to do that. But they, you know, the whole point of the revolution had been to keep and maintain private property. And so that's why they were so hesitant to want to directly tax people's income. So the duty was seen as the fairest way to do that.
What I got from this section was that a lot of the common theme was having one federal government that's in charge of all 13 states, while still giving the states some power, will make everything a lot easier as far as taxation, security, and just administering the government itself. And especially with number 12, it's saying, like, I basically could see Hamilton going up to somebody on the street, you know, or saying basically, you know, I understand you guys work hard for your money. I want you to keep it. You know, you can keep more of it if we set up these duties on imports, but we can do that better, and you can keep more of your money if it's one government controlling all the imports to every state, as opposed to either 3 or 4 confederacies or 13 individual states trying to control what comes in and what goes out.
Yeah, I mean, in a previous one, I think he lists, you know, how everybody will be able to, you know, merchants and laborers, you will be able to keep more of your money with this larger government.
Also, I think the thing is that with the federal power and the taxation being equitable, it wouldn't be like Virginia paid more than South Carolina, and they could not contribute as much toward the revolution, things like that. The federal government would be forced to be equitable to all the states. Mm-hmm. And once Virginia wouldn't pay any more than, you know, than North Carolina.
With regards to the duty, regards to the duty, were they concerned that since they were going to kind of push responsibility income onto imports, were they at all concerned with what kind of effect that would have on said imports?
Oh yeah. You the duties or the tariff, as it became known, becomes a very volatile political issue, because those who are engaged in farming and agriculture really didn't like the idea of a duty, because it raised the cost of those imported goods that they depended on. So yeah, a real solid rift develops. Whereas, you know, Hamilton also was a big proponent of duties or a tariff because he wants to promote manufacturing. You know, he's making the argument, wait a minute, we're sending raw cotton to Great Britain for 3 cents a ton, and then we're buying it back as clothing for 10 cents a ton. So there's also, he doesn't talk about it in any of these particular papers, but he once he becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury, yeah, he wants to use those duties to raise revenue as well as protect American manufacturing. So it becomes, it's a real touchy issue.
Wasn't that one of the risks in the Civil War? Mm-hmm. That the fact that the Confederates did not want high tariffs, they didn't want improvement because it would raise the price of their exported goods.
Right, and then quite often there would be retaliation.
Oh, absolutely.
They would then put a tariff or raise the tariff on southern cotton. And then so British merchants would go to perhaps Egypt to get their cotton. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it certainly was a very important issue. I just told my students yesterday that you could make an argument that the tariff caused the Civil War. We want to make it so simple as it was just slavery, but it was a much bigger issue. And, that's a lot of what these Federalist Papers are about, is this argument of should we have this strong national government or not, and it took the Civil War to ultimately resolve that. Although, you look at a lot of the battles we have today, and it's,
trying to roll back the clock.
Right, exactly.
And I have wonderful people like Mitch McConnell in government saying, I was elected to do this, this, and this, I don't care. My job is to make Obama a one-term president.
Right, exactly.
It's really pretty
pretty striking too, how they're really saying, if we don't do this, we are on a real collision course with fate here. And when 15 through 20, he talks about all these different examples. Starting out with number 15, I notice he says towards the end that there's two about the middle to the end. There's two possibilities for keeping order. There's going to be the coercion of the magistracy or by the coercion of arms. And then I realized that was kind of the theme for those next 5 papers, is that there's two possibilities here. We're going to keep order by law or by force, which I guess is sort of I don't know if there's an intentional echo of Machiavelli there or what, but we're going to have to do it one of those two ways. And he says, hey, in all these weak confederations, whether you're talking about the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, the Amphitryon, one of the ancient Greek leagues, all these places had war, and it was not the problem that the central government was too powerful. It was the problem that the central government was too weak, and they always lead to war. And there's one of the funnier lines, I thought, in that, it was in Federalist Paper number 20, was that he said, that we have this confederacy in the Netherlands, and he said, so such is the nature of the celebrated Belgic Confederacy as delineated on parchment. What are the characters in which practice has stamped upon it? Imbecility in the government, discord among the provinces, foreign influence and indignities, a precarious existence in peace, and peculiar calamities from war. So you have a weak central government, you get a terrible government. And so you've got to have some kind of strength at the center in order to be able to have a real a country that can stand on its own 2 feet. You don't want so much decentralization that you're just in terrible shape. And he goes through that in a lot of detail in all these different countries. I thought that was very interesting.
Especially with that one, number 20. I thought it was interesting that right after that it said that Grotius remarked that basically the only thing that kept the Netherlands together for that time was the fact that they were more afraid of Austria coming in and taking them over, so they kind of put aside their own differences because there was a bigger bully on the block.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and quite frequently throughout the ones where he's attacking the weakness of the Confederacy, he just, we're going to get rolled over, we're going to end up fighting ourselves, we're going to end up fighting our enemies, and we could be in this state of constant warfare if we don't have a strong government to keep us together and to keep foreign invaders out.
It's interesting that really for the first 22 papers, they really haven't discussed almost any specifics of the Constitution yet. It's basically, things are so bad we need a strong central government. They haven't yet gotten into a whole lot, except for general ideas. We'll be able to defend the country, and we'll be able to. But it's interesting that was, we're a quarter of the way through, and they're really focusing on that big picture the whole time so far. And it's going to be interesting to see them get to the smaller details of the Constitution. But it's obvious that this was something they felt would be very persuasive to.
Well, what I found interesting was reading number 14. It was basically, Madison was basically saying, I don't understand why people are still objecting to this idea of having a strong federal government. We can see from this from all these things that it makes more sense based on what they said in the previous papers. But then after 14, it's basically like, okay, if you're still not convinced, here's 6 or 7 examples from throughout history of confederations that haven't worked for one reason or another. So it's kind of like just trying to really beat it into people that...
Yeah, it's remarkable how he uses these examples from history to say confederacies with weak central governments are just doomed to failure.
I found something Hamilton wrote. He says here, conflicting economic and political interests will be reduced to a representative Congress, whose legislation will be subject to the presidential veto and judicial review. This system of checks and balances and the constitutional clear delineation of the powers of the federal government. This is what he was talking about. The federal government had its power and the state would have its power, and that would be no mix-up. And you know, as long as every state has the same power, it would be a better thing to have a constitution. I mean, a constitution.
Sure.
And in 17, he said that the states worrying about the federal government kind of usurping their power authority. He says the state governments are always going to be more popular and powerful. So they're going to be more popular with their local populations because it's closer to them. And he worries that the states could encroach on federal power instead of the other way around, which the anti-federalists were arguing. And he points out that the states basically will be handling criminal and civil cases, which is where a lot of the real power is.
Yeah, I thought that it was interesting in 17 because that was, I noticed that's probably the first major mistake that they made, in the sense that they really didn't see that, yes, the federal government would be interested in exercising police power in the states. That when they're talking about, you know, the expansion of the federal judiciary and federal prosecutors and the FBI. I mean, and I guess maybe Hamilton did think that was a possibility, but it's not. He's going to say that when you're trying to ratify the Constitution, it's giving up the game to the anti-federalists. But it's really interesting that he basically says, you know, there's really no risk, because it seemed like he thought, like, glory is in the glory that people are going to want is in the international power. It's not in, you know, micromanaging the states.
Right.
But it's, I found that kind of surprising that he didn't think that there was, or at least didn't admit that there would be the interest of the federal government into the states. And maybe that shows a little bit just how much the idea of what the federal government was supposed to be has evolved since the 1700s. Who knows? But it was interesting that he took that position. But yeah,
Certain people would argue that the opposite happened, that the federal government has become intrusive into the state powers.
yeah.
Another one, you know, you talked about in the kind of the introduction is number 14, which people were, you know, arguing that a republic could not work on such a large scale, but those people who were arguing that were arguing for kind of like for democracy, and Hamilton's like, well, democracy can't really work on the scale that you're talking about.
He's basically saying, yeah, I know a democracy can't work. That's not what we're trying to do. We want a republic.
Right, exactly. And he said that a republic is ideal for such a large territory because a democracy almost is inferring or implying that everybody is going to be involved, and Hamilton saying, no, you can't really do that.
Yeah.
So since we're so large, we need to have representatives of the people.
And he kind of says that you have democracy in the fact that you will be able to vote for the representatives that will represent your state in the federal government. So you still have your democracy. We're just streamlining it and making it a little bit better.
Okay. And their ideal of a politician in a republic was always somebody who would not serve his or her own interests, but the interest of the people who sent them there. So he's now worried that one person is going to represent 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever amount of people, because those people are going to do what's in the best interest of the people they're representing.
If only a majority of Congress still did that.
I mean, it's...
I was before lobbyists, right?
So...
Yeah, it's really interesting that a couple times, I think it was more in the first 12 than or the first 11 than in these 11, but they say, you know, one of the arguments of this is we're going to get the best men, you know, and the word elitist is not usually a word that I'm trying to use in a more neutral sense, and it was we're getting the best people here, the elites, the people that are truly going to put their own interests aside, and that's going to, because we're going to be able to get these people from sort of the cream of the crop from every state, and we'll be able to get them there to make these decisions. And that was really their hope, that the ideal of the disinterested politician.
I mean, as they were, formulating the presidency, they had George Washington in mind, who perfectly embodied republicanism.
Mm-hmm.
George Washington was never in it for himself. He was always in it as he truly viewed it as public service. when he served in the Revolutionary War, he didn't take a salary. He refused to be paid. He was serving his country. And so as they set up this system, they just kept thinking, everyone's going to be like George Washington. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't get George Washington. You may have to Google this, but we get Wilbur Mills.
I found it interesting in 14 as well that towards the end, Madison writing this has a real kind of flourish, rhetorical flourish at the end, saying that, this is America. We do new things. Don't shut your hearts against the poison which it conveys, the kindred blood which flows in the veins of American citizens, the mingled blood which they have shed in defense of their sacred rights. Consecrate their union and excite horror at the idea of their becoming aliens, rivals, enemies. And if novelties are to be shunned, believe me, the most alarming of all novelties, the most wild of all projects, the most rash of all attempts, is that of rending us in pieces, in order to preserve our liberties and promote our happiness. But why is the experiment on an extended republic to be rejected merely because it may comprise what is new? Is it not the glory of the people of America that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names, to overrule suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, the lessons of their own experience. So this is America. We don't have to be. We respect the past. They've made that pretty abundantly clear. But we don't have to be. We don't have to just do it the way it's always been done. We can do something new.
And it's also kind of saying, just because we might end up failing doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yeah, I love that. Why should we reject this merely because it's new? There's no reason to be afraid of it, because clearly the things in the past had failed, and they were aware of that. What do you do if you obviously you've cast off monarchy? There is really no other government around at the time, so let's try something new. Go back to what they did in antiquity and see if we can learn from their mistakes, their failings, and fix it.
You get some of the classic kind of American exceptionalism or American messianism, where we have a mission to make this work so that we can uplift the world. And that's always been an interesting part of the kind of the American way it thinks about itself in the world. This is something special that, and it's interesting to just see it expressed in different places, and how that's made such a mark on the way we still think about the United States. Is if you want to, nobody's going to elect a president saying we're just another country,
right?
We're just you can't do that and you expect to really stir people, and so it's become an important part of our culture.
No, in 15, which I found one of my favorite ones, because it really is what a lot of what led to this process, is that Hamilton writes, we're on the last stage of national humiliation. And that's what a lot of the founders felt, was that the rest of the world was kind of laughing at us, because you'd send someone over to make a trade agreement and they'd say, where do we go? Well, you got to go to Georgia, you got to go to South Carolina, you got to go to North Carolina, you got to go. And foreign nations just did not want to come here and have to deal with 13 different state governments. He points out we're not paying off our debts. We've borrowed money from private citizens and foreign governments. We're not paying that back. We look like fools.
It's kind of like 15 starts it, and it's kind of carried through the rest of them in this section, that it's like, okay, we've tried being a confederation. It's not working.
Right.
Continuing to do it is only going to make the hole deeper. It's not going to we're not going to magically dig ourselves down to a flight of stairs that's going to lead us into the sunshine. We need to do something to fix it.
Yeah, and he just keeps talking about, we were supposed to have right to use the Mississippi, and Spain's giving us trouble. Spain, necessarily is not going to fear 13 individual, but one strong federal government, then, we would speak.
How are these countries that have been around for, at this point, hundreds of years, supposed to fear us when we're just some up-and-comer and we can't even get our own pieces all on one line thinking the same thing.
Yeah, and I think this one is such a perfect lead up to the ones that follows, in which he says, look, we've got these problems, can't pay the debt, list all these problems. And he says the reason we have these problems is because of Confederacy. You know, all of our problems are a result of this weak national government. And then, okay, it's not just us who have failed trying the Confederacy. Here are all the others as well, past and present, you know, so.
It's like basically saying, you know, we won't be the first confederation to fail, but if we can be the first federal republic to fail, at least then we're making history for...
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, in number 16 is, you know, subtitled the insufficiency of the present confederation to preserve the union. You know, there's that alarmist again. If we don't do this, we're gonna fall apart, and who knows what could end up happening to us. You know, and I think that the biggest case he makes there in number 16 is we need one strong national army to protect us and to keep us together.
Yeah, there was a section in there where it was talking about it'd be better to have one national army that can protect the entire border, because if it's left to a few confederacies or 13 individual states, they're going to be crushed under the weight of their individual armies trying to protect every single inch of their individual borders from every direction. But if you have one national army and one nation under one federal government, then the interior borders between the states don't matter so much. Then you can turn all eyes outward and see everything that's coming at you.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I've picked up on reading these is, you know, the common perception is that the founders feared strong national government, and really I'm finding that's really not the case at all. You know, that they embrace strong national government. It just needs to be in the right hands.
And proper fences on it.
Sure. Yes.
But yeah, it's not. I mean, yeah, the Constitution is essentially these are an argument for a federal government that can be worth the name.
Well, yeah. In one of the previous Federalist Papers, he says, you know, look, Congress has the enumerated powers. That's going to be all it's going to do for those of you who fear it. But it is going to be powerful in areas that we feel it needs to be powerful in.
When I was talking about, like, you know, people drawn to serve the government will be the best of people and look out for the interest of everybody. There's another section in there that, at least to me, it said that, you know, when you have the best of people running things, they will know where the limits are and where they need to be so that they don't become corrupt and too powerful and all of that.
Yeah, they're so well written and they're so eloquent, and it has been truly enlightening because, like most history majors I've read, a handful of these, they always pick out the couple that seem to be the most popular, in some people's eyes, the ones that best describe. But I think reading these from beginning to end is going to, by the time we finish, going to give me a whole new perspective on the founders. It's just been very, very enlightening.
It's like with reading these, it's like this is what they wanted the government to be with the Constitution. And I look at the debates that go on, or just what happens day to day in government now. It's like, what happened to knock us down from this pedestal that we were on to where we're at now?
Yeah.
And what do we need to do to fix it?
Yeah. Definitely.
Although I'm sure there are times, you know, in this, you know, probably 1790, you know, a couple of years after the Constitution was ratified, people are already going, you know, just because we remember the eloquent stuff, and there was, you know, the shenanigans back then too. But I think I would trade the political culture of the 1790s for the political culture of today. If even with the crazy stuff they sometimes said about Thomas Jefferson or
Yeah.
John, there was definitely some attack ads back then too, in different terms, but in different media. But
I think one of the things in physical culture, when you were speaking in the antebellum history, they didn't have half of the international involvement that we have today. They didn't have wars, and it wasn't. They didn't have the emergence of the new nation, China and India. They were dealing with probably what is East Coast phenomenon, wherever they were, and that was it.
Yeah.
But now that you got to deal with the rising nation of China, and everybody's got a nuclear warhead. So I think the way they handle things today may not be as cogent as they did before. But when you consider the vastness of it, the vicissitudes, I think it works fairly well.
Yeah.
That's my personal opinion.
It was so much more of a simpler,
That's what I'm saying.
I don't know if a simpler time or simpler society,
It's kind of like because there weren't all these outside distractions,
That's right.
for lack of a better word, from international issues or other countries doing things. They had time to go digging up skeletons on other people in government.
Sure.
Especially when you consider America at that time was not the most powerful nation in the world.
Oh, yeah.
Today they are, and they have to police the world
Mm-hmm.
to maintain their hegemony, as I see it.
Yeah, no, it certainly is a different time.
and in our political culture is much more, I think, nationalized now than it was at the time, in the sense that the federal government's more important than it since the Civil War than it was before the Civil War. The mass media make it possible for more people to follow what's going on. We look to the president as much more of the embodiment of the of national leadership. Than the president is more important now than back then. So I imagine, I think the average person at this time was a little more concerned with the local authorities than we are today, as opposed to everybody being able to follow. If you want to, everybody can follow politics pretty closely at the national level in a way that's probably different at this time too. And I think that makes a difference.
Yeah, I don't know how many Federalist papers they would have had to put out if they could only tweet 140 characters.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I'm pretty sure if you had to tweet the Federalist Papers, that would basically crash the internet.
Now, in the last two, 21 and 22, one of the things that stuck out to me was, Hamilton saying that we don't want to end up in a situation where the bigger states can really have, he talks about that whole idea of big states versus little states. Should all the states have the same amount of power? And he's like, pretty much in a democracy, majority has to rule.
Yeah. Well, the last two I kind of found interesting because it's kind of arguing against the idea of basing things off either the physical size of, in this case, the state, where you have bigger states at the time like New York or Virginia that have all this area and they might have more people, but it's concentrated a little bit more in certain areas, or you could have smaller states that have more people crammed in compared to some of the bigger or medium-sized states. So
I think that was the first argument they had in the convention for the Constitution.
Yeah.
Where the smaller states, that was the Connecticut Compromise, where the smaller state, then you had your bicameral Congress,
Right.
Because otherwise the smaller states would be, they would be represented as well as they should.
Remember right, based on population, I think it's about 5 states accounted for over half the population.
Well, there's a footnote in the copy I have in number 22 that says New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Georgia, South Carolina, and Maryland were a majority of the whole number of states, but did not contain 1/3 of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he talks about how one of the examples he gives if we're in a war as a whole, if a majority wants to sign a peace treaty, a minority could stop that.
Yes.
Yeah, and he becomes very concerned about the minority being able to kind of derail things.
And there was also the discussion about, proximity of where Like if something's going on, say in Massachusetts, people in Virginia or North Carolina or Georgia aren't necessarily going to care about it because they're farther away, so why should they have to sit through the discussions of why this treaty needs to be signed or why they should send troops to go help with this?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to a lot of what we talked about last week is nationalism, unity. You know, we need to try to figure out how to be one people. Do what's in the best interest of everyone.
It's kind of saying it's okay if you want to call yourself a Virginian or a Georgian or a Carolinian, but it's more important that you consider yourself an American first and foremost.
Yeah. And then I think it was in 21 as well, where he talks about, one of the biggest reasons we need to do this is because the national government has no power. It basically asks people to behave or asks people to comply. It has no power or no authority to enforce anything.
Yeah, I used this analogy in one of my the U.S. history class last semester, where the federal government was basically Oliver going up to the man in the workhouse with the spoon, going, "Please, sir, can I have some more?"
Yeah, exactly. And he just, he says we just can't have that. When necessary, the federal government needs to be able to compel.
And that was even a problem during the Revolution, right? Where states didn't want to send people to the Continental Army. And,
right, they want to keep them for their own state militias.
Yeah, that was discussed in number 21, because they were saying states where there was fighting, like New York and Massachusetts, were going to want to send people to meet the quotas that were required or exceed them, but like you said, people in other states were like, well, fighting's up there.
Right.
Why do I have to go die there when I can die defending my state?
And I just can't help, especially as they're attacking these confederacies, kept thinking to myself, why didn't the Southerners read these? Read how 13 states going in different directions. It was a miracle that we won the Revolution. Now they as 11 independent states in their little confederacy really going to go up against 22 cohesive northern states under one strong government?
Don't you think that's a little more, and it's something I've been curious about myself, especially with the way things are backsliding now. You've got people arguing for states having all kinds of stronger rights, wanting to rewrite things to make the states running the show, and a lot of them are coming from southern states.
Oh, sure.
So, don't you think it's kind of like maybe a mentality or something in culture?
Yeah, I think that there is an inherent distrust of the national government, especially I think because they always view, when the northern population began to dwarf the southern population and they began to control much of the national government, they just really became paranoid about the government going in a direction they didn't want it to go in, and I think they've just always kind of maintained that.
And there's a kind of an interesting trend in American history where the more the political party that tends to be more about centralizing government tends to have a home in the Northeast, and the party that's more distrustful tends to have a home in the South. So you think about the Federalists were strong in New England, the Whigs were strong in New England, the Republicans were strong in New England. Under Lincoln, when they were more centralizing, the Democrats, as long as they tended to be more about states' rights, tend to have a stronger home in the South. And then with the reversal of some of those things, the Democrats have found their home in Northeast and absorbed most of the moderate Republicans from those areas. And the Republicans in the 50s, 60s, and 70s found their new home in the people would have considered voting for a Republican before the 60s and 70s, except at the local level. Even local Democrats have started disappearing from the South, elected by white voters anyway in the South. And so it's an interesting cultural difference between wherever it is the more in the North and the South about how much you trust the federal government to have central power, and it's interesting ways. I mentioned an article last week, but by Walter Russell Mead called the Age of Hamilton, which is, it's not real long, but if you look that up, it's an interesting kind of theory of how that has worked, that Hamilton as the centralizer and Jefferson as the skeptic of centralization, and kind of trying to follow American history. So
Yeah, but Jefferson's philosophy was that government is government least, government's best.
yeah,
So naturally, he would not be a strong federalist.
right.
Yeah, it all just kind of came down to the vision for the country. People in the Northeast really couldn't make a living through commercial agriculture with slave labor like they could in the South.
The land was too poor.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so people in the Northeast looked more toward manufacturing, so they needed infrastructure, roads and stuff built,
Right,
and
exactly.
they viewed one of the roles of the national government to promote that national development, to build those roads and those bridges and open up new markets. Where in the South, they were perfectly happy to just grow cotton or tobacco, rice, and send it on a ship off to England. Because they were making enough money doing that for, sending raw materials. Whereas in the Northeast, to make money, they needed to manufacture. So they want protective tariffs to keep out English-made goods. Whereas the South, like, oh, that's gonna, it's costing me money. So, the Northeasterners would argue, well, we're thinking nationally, but were they really thinking nationally, or were they more or less thinking of their own interests?
That's interesting.
No, they claimed that was a nationalist argument, but to Southerners it was, no, that's just helping you, it's not helping us. So how national is that?
Right, with the tariff and with the disagreement about slavery, the Southerners felt like they're running it for their section, and that's why we got to get out of here.
Sure.
And stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting how that all worked out.
Yeah, they saw in Lincoln someone who was going to really run a powerful national government to bring about economic development.
I think when they saw the proliferation of the population in the Northeast, that sort of unnerved them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was growing, because at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, the gross national product was 51% cotton.
Sure.
But they could see the handwriting was on the wall, McCormick's Reapers and all those type of things, and steels, and they just knew that the handwriting was on the wall. In order to change their peculiar institution, they were ready to go to war because they couldn't take that.
Right. Their way of life was coming to an end and was being challenged by the North, and they saw the government going in a direction they didn't want it going in.
I would point to a Latin phrase in number 15, imperium in imperio. They still in fine seem to cherish with blind devotion the political monster of an imperium in imperio. This renders a full display of the principal defects of the Confederation necessary in order to show that the evils we experience do not proceed from minute or partial imperfection, but from fundamental errors in the structure of the building, which cannot be amended otherwise than by an alteration in the first principles of the main pillars of the fabric. Actually, there was a group, or a novel later written by a black man named Griggs, of that same title, Imperium in Imperio, and his novel was popular among blacks at the time, the turn of the last century, and it basically proposed a utopian ideal of a black nationalism within, sort of underneath the fabric of our existing government. They even had officers and so forth. So we talk a lot about the geographic, lines that determine the different states, but underneath that, I mean, these are just imaginary lines. Underneath that, there's all kinds of different separations that these papers also speak to.
Oh, sure, yeah, the socioeconomic differences amongst people.
Talk about class, and later issues of segregation and how how segregation, arguments for why segregation can't work are the same arguments.
Sure.
Well, like that passage you just read, it's basically like saying, what's the point of fixing your roof if your house is going to collapse because, your basement walls are crumbling.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have to tear everything down and, basically kind of going back to what like people like Socrates and the sophists did in ancient Greece, where it was challenging why people had the mindset that they did and why they thought what they did, and just keep asking why, till you get to some sort of answer where people kind of get that eye-opening light bulb comes on home and go, hey, maybe we should try something else.
Yeah, I would like to refer back to last time when you talked about, somebody brought up the notion of the United Nations and thinking of the concept of this applying to the earth as a whole. And the notion that seems preposterous. But if in fact there was, like, let's say we were in Star Trek and we had another planet that was, menacing us, it wouldn't be too long before we came together and
Yeah, that's a really
in the same manner using the same principles.
Yeah. And that is when you can find common ground, or you can rally around common causes. It's funny how quickly those barriers fall and drop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think throughout these so far they've been arguing that how unified we could become if we just had this one national government. So when there is something, an outside force that will rally us together.
I think it was whichever paper it was where they were talking about the Netherlands, and it was talking about their tax system, where it was every province had to pay the same rate regardless of what their population was, what they could actually afford to pay, and the ones who couldn't pay were always beholden to the ones who could, and really the only thing that kept them together was the fact that everybody in the Netherlands was afraid of Austria coming in and taking over. So they even acknowledged in that paper that it was like, okay, the North has more people, or more timber, so they can do this. The South can do this. So instead of trying to say everybody everywhere has to pay this amount in this, it's okay, let's see what you can do and what you can afford to send to the federal government and find that balance. Like they made the allusion to, water will find its own level. It'll splash around a little bit, but eventually it'll even out and get calm.
That sounds good in socialism, but it doesn't work in democracy.
Well,
It just doesn't work that way.
Well, there's a couple of examples in here that Hamilton gives where fear is what brings people together, and he's almost suggesting, don't wait for that to happen. Let's get together before we have to, out of fear or something like that.
Well, I don't think you have to, call that socialism. The idea is how efficient an arrangement can you build among men and women, excuse me, that is built upon a deep understanding of human nature, and based on the various forces that are at work, and ultimately nature as a whole.
All right. No, and especially in the first 11, they talked about human nature a lot. And maybe that by building this strong national government, it can help overcome man's nature, men's tendency to think only of themselves or only act in their own self-interest. So yeah, they were fully aware of that.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked about this grouping was that there's this general sense of the writers of the papers are saying, okay, yes, everybody in America is a little bit different. We have different aspirations based on class, economic status, geography, or whatever, but we should all, recognize that we're all different, but we're all working towards the same goal, and let's concentrate on that one goal being the end game as opposed to getting distracted by, oh, you're from Virginia, you're from New York, you're from New Hampshire, and squabbling over crumbs falling off the table, basically.
I think the goal at that time was a manifest destiny. I think they were trying to use it much to be good.
I certainly think that, you know, the individual wealth was certainly, I think they make no bones about it. They have no problems with people being able to make as much money as they can. I mean, that certainly is a very, very important theme here. But when you consider so many people came here so that they could, you know, make money, I mean, it just almost seemed kind of natural. You know, it's funny how, I mean, we're only through the first 22, but they talk very little about this powerful national government doing anything to help people socially, or it's all about making money.
Yeah, it's an order for freedom. It's the fence that around the foundation on which you can have all this kind of freedom for economic activity, political activity, and things like that. So it's very it's got overall pretty minimal goals in terms of changing the society. The foundation for any kind of activity in the society is the order. Yeah, it's very different from often the way that political campaigns are today. Whereas we have this idea, this idea, and this idea to help you, or whatever. It's just we're here. Do your thing. We'll keep the pirates and the British away.
Right. It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
They keep mentioning this idea of the utility of the government, as in, the government is there to secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, which really they were just saying is this government will help the greatest number of people make the most money they possibly can.
That was that nation of commerce, and then also manifest destiny, as Mr. Nixon mentioned, just in terms of, I think most of the founders would see would see the westward movement of the United States as a natural thing too. Is one of the things that every settler in the United States wanted, even in the colonial period, was when's that land going to open up? There's a proclamation of 1763 that put the clamp on the anything west of the Appalachians was just so frustrating to people who felt like, we fought the war, when's the land coming? And of course the British had to worry about how the Indians were going to take it. So that idea that, this is the continent we're destined to go out there, I think, Jefferson talking about I think it was the early 1800s when he talked about the Empire of Liberty, and the Louisiana Purchase, just this idea that, United States will be a great blessing to mankind by its expansion, by its power. It's very, that idea of manifest destiny is there even before John O'Sullivan writes it, for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's,
we have the best system. It's our job to go out and promote that system and expand it as much as we can. And clearly in several of these papers, he talks about land value, that a strong national government will keep land prices up and going up. Because in one of them he talks there, one of the problems is that land rates, the price of land is dropping because of a weak national government.
Was that because of security or currency?
Yeah, especially out in the western lands, and the currency, every state was printing their own money, just causing all kinds of chaos. And the land was just really so much on their mind because it was the principal way to make wealth back then. And they just didn't print money back then. You had to create your own wealth, and the way to create your own wealth was to have land. And if the value of land dropped, you were in trouble.
There's some mention in these papers about law and the need to be able to punish, and so that's to give teeth to agreements. And they point to agreements where it's just sort of it's basically a recommendation, and so that law becomes an important, I think, is sort of introduced here as an important component.
Oh yeah, definitely. They very much valued the rule of law and people having to follow that law. I think it's in 21 where he just talks about, the national government just has no authority to enforce any of its laws. And yeah, that's always been a very important part of the founding, is the fact that we don't want to be a nation of the whims of some king. We want to write down a law and we want to follow it and be able to punish those who don't. A lot of people who opposed the revolution were lawyers because they were very concerned. Are we going to reestablish a country with law and order?
That's interesting.
Yeah, they were very, very, because, under the British system, they had this tradition of law and order, and they really worried about that. So, lawyers. So, I don't know if they were addressing that because of lawyers, but that was, those people who were in charge were very much in favor of it. That's why I sometimes tell my students, that's why we have so many people in prison in this country. It's because we're anal about the rule of law in this country. We're not very forgiving of those who break the laws, because I think it just goes back to our colonial heritage. We all have collectively agreed to this rule, so you all better obey it.
And then there's every once in a while that person that just very slightly broke the law, like, oh, you're going to get the harshest punishment possible because, if you're doing it, then who knows who else is going to do it, so you're going to be the example.
Well, in Shays' rebellion, Sam Adams said of Shays and his followers, any man who breaks the law of a republic ought to suffer death. Because the founders thought, okay, it's one thing to protest and break a law that some king or some parliament thousands of miles away made. But when your own democratically elected representatives make a law, you can't break that.
You're talking about federal law?
Any law.
In this case, Massachusetts law, the Shays were
right. They after they broke free, they never thought that there would be oppression if it was democratically elected laws.
It is saying if you elect someone to represent you in federal government and they agree to a law, then by proxy, because you elected them, you agree to the terms of the law.
There's no such thing as an unfair law if it's by the people's representatives, or no unjust laws. It wasn't.
One thing is the law, you're correct, but there is a strict construction of the law and a loose construction of the law. There's always ways you don't break the law, but you can bend it. And that's what they do.
Well, and then it was fine. I don't know if he was the first, but, he wasn't obviously the first, but, Henry David Thoreau said, you know what, that's man's law. There's a higher law.
Yes.
And when the man's law conflicts with the higher law, you can break that and commit civil disobedience, and that's what Martin Luther King Jr. said during the civil rights movement. Yeah, that's man's law, but you know what? God's law is a little bit higher than that, so.
That's man's law. Man can be wrong.
Right, exactly.
Well, there's also the people who didn't vote for the representative.
Well, but if he got the majority, he's got to be right.
Tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. No one ever thought there could be tyranny of the majority.
But the concept of law is derived from the idea of taking some power away from a king or ruler, and rather have an edict, to have a law that gives you a basis to understand where you stand.
Sure.
With respect to your whatever form of government you have.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of what would define civilization. Would be you start to have laws and rules and codes of conduct. What was the first laws of
Hammurabi?
Yeah, Hammurabi. So that's one of the things that kind of began.
In the talk about the territories to the west seems to bring up the concept of the public trust doctrine, where the idea that what no individual owns, we all own together.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's yeah. In fact, they talk about that.
Yeah, they said in one of the previous papers that it's better to have a national government that owns this basically empty land that we haven't explored yet, because if it's the various states fighting over where these imaginary borders are because of different treaties and agreements and proclamations and whatever, it'll just invite constant war over, and it'll destroy the land before people can really see what's there.
So the next time we're going to be reading our next installment in 2 weeks, and we'll be getting into some more of the inner workings, I believe, of the Constitution, and going towards looking at the checks and balances. And so, if you don't have a copy of the Federalist Papers, one of the great things about actually some of the greatest books and literature ever written is it's often in the public domain, so it's cheap. This is, it's $10 or so to get the Federalist Papers if you want to read them along with us. So thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody for being here, and we'll see you next time.